Jahangir, will you be able to admit people while I'm speaking? So, dear participants, one more time, thank you for allocating in time and joining today's our activity. Allow me first of all to introduce myself. My name is Amir Said Sadikov. I am a business development coordinator in the representative office of British Council in Uzbekistan. As we already discussed several times in our previous communications, today we are launching our first session devoted to the targeting band 6 and 7 in IELTS. And it is going to be delivered by our colleagues from the global team, Dr. Joanna Mataram and Erika Balas and Mark Solovans. Joanna and her colleagues have been working for many years in teaching and developing tests in many countries, like in Japan, Singapore, Taiwan, and etc. Joanna, may I give us floor to you, please?
Yep, that would be fine. It'd be wonderful, even. Thank you very much, Amir Said. And I hope you can see me somewhere. I'm not really sure about how my Zoom is working. It's great to be here, and I'll just quickly tell you, I hope. There we go. You can see me there. I'm Joanna Mottram. I work with the British Council in working with governments and institutions about making decisions about how they can best use English language tests. Largely, I work with the British Council's computer-based test of English, which is called APTIS. But before I started working on APTIS, I did a lot of work looking at IELTS. I did a master's thesis looking at how candidates prepare for IELTS. I have 2 published IELTS research reports looking at how candidates prepare for IELTS in classrooms and outside classrooms. And my PhD thesis was looking at IELTS writing, the general training module. But largely, I've been looking at IELTS from an outsider perspective, either thinking about it as a researcher or thinking about IELTS as a teacher or a trainer. I've also spent quite a few years working with candidates as they prepare for IELTS as a trainer and as an advisor. My colleagues who are going to be speaking as well today and in the next couple of weeks, Erika and Mark, they're both very much more insider views of IELTS. They've both worked as IELTS examiners, so can bring some really clear insight into what the examiners expect of you, particularly in the speaking and the writing. So I will certainly hand over to their expertise when we start speaking about the productive skills. So how are we going to approach this? Because as you can tell from how I'm speaking, we don't have much time. We're in a big hurry. We really want to get this done. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about what IELTS is, but we're not going to go into, there are this many questions and this many items and things like that. You can get all of that from a really good quality IELTS preparation book. I've seen on your responses to information that we were asking for in your registration that many of you are looking at the British Council website, the Cambridge Assessment website for information about IELTS, and those are great places to look. I'd always encourage you first to go to the publisher's website. So Cambridge Assessment and British Council will give you the best information that you can trust about the test. In terms of textbooks, again, the Cambridge University Press textbooks about preparing for IELTS, you can be very confident that they have the right information in those. So anyway, today we're going to talk about targeting band 6 and 7, particularly in the receptive skills, what it means to be a band 6 or a band 7 user of English, particularly with reference to listening and reading. We're going to talk about how once we know that what it means to be at that level, we can think about how best to prepare for the test if that is our goal score. So we sort of need to understand what we want to be before we can talk about how we can prepare for it. We'll also talk about how you can use authentic resources to do that, either if you're preparing yourself or if you're preparing others for the test. Authentic resources, and by that I mean texts that were written not for test preparation, but for other purposes, they're very, very useful, particularly at the high levels for IELTS preparation. Then I'll hand over to my colleague, Mark, who'll talk about effective IELTS strategies. And then right at the end of our session today, Erica will talk to you about how you're going to need to do some homework before next week's session, when we'll be looking at writing and writing at band 6, band 7, and what we're expecting or what the examiner's expecting from candidates at that level. So starting off, we need to understand what we're looking for, what our goal is as we're preparing to be a band 6 or a band 7 IELTS. So the information we can get about this, we know that there's IELTS scores reported as bands 1 to 9. We're not interested today at all about bands 1 to 4 really, because a band 1 to 4 can't understand me as I'm speaking quickly about IELTS and about English testing. We're really interested about bands 5 to 7 today, but more about 6 and 7. There are overall descriptions of IELTS band scores published. Now, band 5, you can see there, a partial command of the language, copes with overall meaning in most situations. They make a lot of mistakes. They can do basic communication in their own field. However, a band 6 user, we're getting quite a bit more competent. So from the IELTS overall band descriptors, we can see that a band 6 user, competent user, effective command, still some inaccuracies, some mistakes. They can use and understand fairly complex language, particularly in familiar situations. Those words are highlighted for a reason. They're quite important when we're thinking about what is it to be a band 6 competent user. We know that they can do quite a bit. They rarely get lost. They rarely get stuck. How about being a band 7 good user? Right. A band 7 user has operational command. They have, a few mistakes, but I have mistakes. We all have mistakes. We won't worry about mistakes. Hello?
Donna, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Something very odd happened just then. Thank you. So a band 7 is a good user, and the test taker has operational command of the language, a few mistakes sometimes, and they can generally handle complex language well and understand detailed reasoning. So they're a very, very strong user, really, of English. My colleague, Vicky, who's not here today, but anyway, she likes to describe a band 7 as someone you can sit down next to at a dinner party and have no problems them understanding you, no problems understanding them. So it's a very, very relaxed, competent user of English. So if we think about this overall descriptor, we can see that if we want band 7 in IELTS, we need to be a really comfortable, competent user of English. So the aim here is not, do I master one small task, or do I master, one kind of reading item and one kind of listening item, or maybe 5 kinds of reading tasks. The idea is that you become a good user, a competent user first, and then you start thinking about how you can demonstrate that proficiency in the IELTS test. So if you're not already this good user or this very competent user, it's unlikely that you're going to all of a sudden get a high IELTS band score. And I know from the questions that came through the registration portal, there's a lot of people saying, is it possible to become an IELTS band 7 in 6 months? It's impossible for us to say that because we don't know where you're starting from. But I think the target should more be, can I become a strong English language user? And then think about the scores. So I know that's not what everyone wants to hear, but language proficiency development first, and then we'll think about the scores. So how can we talk about language proficiency development? Because all we got from IELTS is a very narrow description of what it might be. So the way that we talk about it generally when we're talking about language assessment is we use these things called CFR levels, which are, for these purposes, a big set of lists of what you can do with language at different levels. And we find them very useful for talking about people who have high levels of proficiency. So what we can do is we can say, all right, an IELTS band 7, which from IELTS, we don't really know very much about what they can do in a broad sense. Or sorry, an IELTS maybe band 5, 5.5, and we can say, well, that's about a B1 on the CFR. And then we can say an IELTS 6 to an IELTS 7 is something like a CFR B2. And the CFR gives us a lot more information about what a high-level language user can do with language. So I'm going to jump very quickly because I want to get to the guts of this. So higher levels of proficiency, a B1, with these descriptors, we can start to understand what it is to be a higher English language user. So we can see that a B1, very similar, actually, if you remember the descriptors for 5, and IELTS 5, main points, everyday, familiar, main points, straightforward factual texts. Whereas a B2, and it's a huge jump here, we've got main ideas of complex speech, not clear standard speech, but complex speech, concrete and abstract topics delivered in standard dialect, technical discussions. We have a large degree of independence when reading, which basically means that you can just sit down and read anything. And you can sit down and you can listen to just about anything and get, for example, if you're looking at a band 7, you can understand all of these main ideas, complex speech, concrete and abstract topics that I'm speaking about right now. So how do we get to that level of proficiency? And I'm afraid the main advice there is to actively read widely and often, and to actively listen widely and often. So reading widely means reading a long way outside of your comfort zone, a long way outside of what you prefer to read, across a lot of different topics and a lot of different text types. So information reports, arguments, lots of nonfiction, technical discussions. You need to get used to reading these kinds of things. For the listening, again, listening widely and often. The best idea or the best advice on the listening is to access, and the golden age of the internet means that we can access what are called government radio stations from countries around the world, where there are lots of examples of texts that are similar to the ones that you'll hear in IELTS listening. So this reading and listening widely and often is not a magic bullet because it doesn't work quickly, but it's really key to preparing for these high levels of IELTS. So getting to the actual test, the first thing you need to remember is that IELTS Reading academic version, there are 3 long texts. So the first step to a high score is being able to read those and process them quickly. Practicing skimming texts, reading them quickly to find the right spot to focus on is key. And And to do that, I'm going to say it again, you need to practice reading lots and lots. And I'll come to where you can find good practice texts in a moment. When you're doing the short answer response questions, the kinds of skills that you need to demonstrate are that you can find specific information in the texts. You can find the details. You can read the summary or the notes that you need to fill in, for example, on the screen here. You can read those and you can work out, do I need a noun here? Do I need a verb? And then you can go to the original text and find the right word form to fill in the gap. And you can transfer information, and that might involve paraphrasing, which is going to involve most likely that wide vocabulary. And again, she says it, that wide vocabulary is going to come from wide reading. Just to slip in a strategy here, which I'm sure Mark will mention later on, follow the instructions. Do you need to include one word? Do you need two words? Is it a word plus a number? Following the instructions is the first thing that you need to make sure you do, because if you don't follow the instructions, unfortunately, this is a test and it won't go well for you. It's not very flexible. For the IELTS reading for matching headings, the skills targeted there are global understanding. So are you able to recognize the main ideas or the theme of a paragraph? And can you select from a full text the main ideas and the supporting ones? When you read up and when you check in on IELTS preparation information, and even in the questions that you asked us in the registration forms, time management was brought up again and again, or is brought up again and again as a key to doing well in the reading test. But time management goes hand in hand with how quickly you can read. Again, the texts are long. Reading quickly, skimming the text will help you with this. And going in with the confidence, so your candidate or yourself, going in with the confidence that you can read quickly. This comes with the practice of reading a lot. IELTS listening tasks. All right. We have 4 sections. And I know that you can find this information in a lot of different places. But we can see again that section 1 and section 2 are the easier listening tasks because we're looking at everyday social context, things that candidates are familiar with, learners are familiar with. But sections 3 and 4 are more about the B2 level, the higher level. You're going to have educational or training contexts, and then you've got section 4, which is an academic subject, for example, a university lecture. Unfortunately, once again, the key here is wide and often, and accessing the right kind of texts. So only listening to everyday social context. So while it's wonderful to watch TV and watch everyday dramas, and it's a great thing to do for developing your everyday social context understanding of listening, be it Friends or any other kind of drama that you like to watch, that's not going to help you with section 3 or with section 4. For improving your listening on section 4, you're going to need to get to specialist lectures to understanding those, and things like TED Talks, which are prepared speeches, are going to help you as well. So I'm afraid it's that wide and often, and making sure you have a big range of complexity in the texts that you're listening to. How do we find them though? Which is a fair question. How do we get an authentic resource to use? First thing to do is think about the text source. And I would say, I mentioned before, government radio sources. which will also have podcasts. You can tell perhaps from my voice that I'm Australian. So we have the ABC in Australia, which is the Australian Broadcasting Commission. Through their website, you can access podcasts very wide, very broad. The BBC similarly, and the BBC has resources for language learners, as well as non-graded examples. And seriously, if you are looking for a band 7, or if your learners are looking for a band 7, then they will need to be listening to non-graded texts or reading non-graded texts. With respect to text features that align with those found in IELTS exams, we're looking for complex texts. In the writing, that will mean that there's a lot of noun phrases. There's a lot of dense information. So you can think about text as being on a climb between very verby and very doing to being very, very nouny and about things. It's the very nouny about things texts, which are going to be more like the reading texts that you find in IELTS exams, or like the listening, the academic listening that you find in IELTS exams. And the third point I have here is the idea of going beyond test practice and analysing the texts. And I'm going to give you an example of something that I worked up today, this afternoon. I thought, we do need this example to talk about. So I went on to the BBC website and I looked for something quite wide in terms of range of topic, something that I wouldn't usually read. But I expected that it would be a decent length. So I was looking for something around 1,000 words, which is slightly longer than you'll find in the reading test, but still it's a good length text. And I wanted something that would give us some interesting staging in the text. So when I went in, I didn't look for news. I looked for a more in-depth article. And hopefully you can see there, we have the news, and then I went to business because it's not an area I read in very often. And then I thought something about business / the environment would be interesting. So the article then was, what does a future-proofed home look like? And I wondered, and then decided to start having a bit of a read of the whole article. Now, you can't actually read the whole article when I give it to you, but I can show you what I've done in terms of text analysis with the article. So I thought, all right, I'll read it. And then to help me with understanding how the information is flowing through the article, I thought, well, okay, I'm going to mark up this blue text here is all about the introduction to the article. It's grabbing my interest. It's quite detailing. The red text there are the main points. So I wanted to find out where the main arguments were presented in the article. And then I found the details and the expansion and the not so important information. So if you were preparing candidates for IELTS reading, this is an activity you could ask them to do with a longer text. So marking up and identifying where are the main points, where's the introduction information, where's the supporting information. Other things you could do with a text like this, because there are lots of different voices, there are lots of different experts quoted in this text. So identifying all of the different experts, what they've got to say, and if it supports or detracts from the main points are other ways that you could use this text. It took me about 3 minutes to find this text, and then the reading of it and marking it up and thinking about it like this, perhaps another 10 to 15 minutes. So as teachers, as trainers, it doesn't necessarily take a long time to find authentic texts to use, but they can be extremely motivating for your students. There were questions there in the registration information. How do I motivate my students? I would say using authentic texts is a very good way to motivate your students, because it means that they're engaging with the real world and using their English to engage with the wider information that's available when they can access it with strong English. It's current, so it links in with their view of the world. The other thing is, as you read widely and as you listen widely, you're going to start picking up a lot of ideas about the world, abstract ideas about the world. This one relates to climate change. It also relates to questions in the environment. There's a lot of vocabulary in there that you could recycle come time to write an essay in the writing component of the IELTS exam. So there's a lot of arguments there for using authentic materials. This is looking deeper at parts of that text and looking at the second part, the main points, and then how these are how the examples are expanded, the ideas are expanded. So if you need to look for detail and then supporting information, you can see that there are signpost words like for example and for instance. Your learners add those to their repertoire, both in their reading and in their writing. At the top in the blue text, we can see the way that a soak away, which was a new idea for me when I read this morning, we can see an example of a way that a new word, soak away, is then defined in the text. So this is just 3 different ways from looking deeply at the authentic text that you can help your students increase their reading skills, but also their writing, and help them work out meaning from the soak away, the word that they have no idea what it means, how they can work that out, and then hopefully successfully answer their questions in the reading test. Now, I'm sure I have missed a couple of things that I thought I would speak about. And if they come to me, I'll be sure to add them later on. But I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Mark, now, who's going to speak about effective IELTS strategies. So, Mark, are you there?
I am. Thank you, Joanna. We can just go to the next slide.
There you go.
Thank you. Great. So Joanna's already covered this whole range of what we could say is like genres or types of reading sources or listening sources that you really should be focusing on. And it seems sometimes a little daunting to think, oh, I've got to listen to so many different types of things or to read so many different types of things. But what we're really trying to do is broaden that awareness, broaden that skill, and broaden that vocabulary and understanding of language that you need to be able to successfully control or successfully manage to go from that band 6 up to that band 7 or beyond. So really what I wanted to do is just look at some general effective IELTS strategies that can apply to listening and to reading. So here for listening, it might seem obvious, but I've said to be aware of the skills being assessed and to practice accordingly. Now, many people are doing test practice. They're familiar with IELTS and think, okay, well, how do I get on? But what we want to be doing is thinking about, as Joanna said, if you've got all of these different types of interaction for listening, we've got something in general for part 1 and 2, and academic for part 3 and 4. And for part 1, it's a conversation between people. Part 2, it's just listening to one person. Part 3, it's a conversation again. And part 4, it's just one person, like a lecture. So we know all of these genres and all of these types of interaction. But if we go back and think about what skills is it trying to assess, because it's going from lower level, lower order skills to things that are a little bit more challenging or a little bit harder. So think for a moment about listening part 1. It's a general conversation between people. Now, the thing that it's trying to get people to do, or it's trying to assess people on, is their ability to identify key sounds or key information. Now, one of the things that you can be aware of is that how do you distinguish people who can basically do something or comfortably do something or have a mastery of this level? So if you do listening part 1, you will notice there are quite tricky things to listen for. There will be sounds like M or N when they're spelling out a name. There will be words like 13 or 30, 14 or 40. And every single IELTS test will have something like that that really tests the ability of somebody who can distinguish between those sounds, those phonemes. And that's why they're in there. So if you're aware that they're trying to assess that, you can particularly practice one or two of those things. Likewise, if we think about parts 3 and part 4, we're looking at layers of ideas, layers of opinions, or layers of information. So what will happen, for example, in part 3, there's going to be a conversation among 2 or 3 people. And you'll notice that the information changes. So maybe there's information presented, and that's confirmed by somebody who says, yes, and this is a great point. And yes, we agree on this. Or maybe that idea or that opinion is rejected. And somebody might say, well, yeah, we could have done that. However, I think there's something better we should do instead. Or they might like an idea and say, well, this could be done, but we need to think of another way of solving it. And what we're doing here is we're listening for cohesive language where people say, however, although, or we're looking for language in the turn taking that confirms or reasserts an idea. Or sometimes there's a hesitation, something they're not quite familiar with. Again, this layer of added complexity where people are confirming ideas, rejecting ideas, they are accepting something, they're kind of hedging. Those are built in at the higher level to see whether you or your students can follow that layer of information, whether they can follow the change in the course of the conversation. And of course, for part 4, when we've got a lecture, we're listening to somebody who is presenting on their own. So they're not going to agree or disagree with themselves, but they might present information in a way. For example, they might say, people used to think that the animals lived solely on the island. However, new research has shown that animals migrated across the land. So we are listening for the same thing, but we're listening at a much higher level. And of course, some other things that we can think about. We do need to be careful about some spelling when we're trying to get the answers right on listening. We want to have other strategies about thinking, how do we deal with missing answers? It's always important to just guess if you don't have any answers. And you need to think about how you address things like multiple choice. So there are some basic strategies that can help you prepare for listening. But like Joanna said, these have to be tied into actual real world practice. Look at skills, look at samples, or look at sources that mirror parts 1, 2, 3, and 4. So things like BBC 6-Min English, it's a conversation between people, perfect for things like part 1 or part 3, depending on the topic. And we have words in the news or BBC News, or as Joanna said, there's Australian Broadcasting Corporation, there's news from America. So again, depending on the type, you're going to, depending on the type of conversation, whether it's one person presenting or a podcast where people are discussing, you're going to be mirroring those skills. So moving on to reading, I've said about limiting the time for each section, around 20 minutes. It's important to remember that you're not supposed to, you're not expected to be able to read the whole of the text in full, because it's really limiting your time and it's assessing your ability or the student's ability to quickly find information, to find out where it is and confirm or match what the question is saying with the piece of text that you've found. So we have to bear in mind, what are the skills? We need to get good at underlining keywords in the question and think heavily on synonyms and antonyms, words that have the same meaning or words that have the opposite meaning, because those are the things that we need to be better at decoding for analyzing those questions. So Joanna mentioned earlier the headings questions. Now, one thing that you might prefer to do as a small strategy is that the heading sections often have the match heading questions before the text and then some follow-up questions after the text. Now, some test takers find, in terms of speed and terms of time saving, they prefer to do those follow-up questions first, because if you're focusing on a multiple choice or a yes, no, not given, if you spent time trying to answer those questions, then you do the heading questions later, you'll find that you've already read that paragraph or one or two of those paragraphs, so you have a better understanding of what they are. So it saves a little bit of time. We also need to think about how we take words directly from the text for reading. We don't have to change the form. We don't have to change that noun that we read into an adjective or a verb. We just take the words directly from that and apply them to the answer. You don't need to worry about spelling in reading, because all you have to do is show that you've demonstrated that you've identified the correct information, you've isolated the information, and you've found the answer, basically. Now, this can be very good for test takers. Don't worry about the spelling. As long as an assessor or a rater, person grading the papers, they can see that you've identified the right answer. You don't have to have perfect spelling. It doesn't matter, as long as they can see the answers correct. Now, this does have some added benefits for reading, completely separate from listening though. For reading, if we think about true, false, not given, and yes, no, not given, it doesn't really matter if you get those mixed up. If the question's asking for true, false, or not given, and somebody, you or a student, says yes, if you're writing yes and the answer is true, again, the clerical marker, the person assessing the paper, basically understands that yes, you've identified it, it's correct, it's true, yes, the answer is right. So you will not lose marks. I know that some guides, some websites say that you will lose marks for this, but you don't. So don't worry about that. And what we're trying to look for, again, is just that positive match in answers. So it doesn't really have a massive impact on your skills there, as long as you can identify the information. So there are no other hidden things. There are no other hidden skills that you have to practice. It's really coming back to what Dr. Joanna said, is looking at the language ability, looking at the range of sources, and trying to open up your skill set to all of these things so that you can come back to focusing on a strategy for IELTS. You really need to remember to separate that practicing IELTS is perfectly fine. You can do practice from books, from online tests, to get better at your strategies for taking a test and your awareness of the different tasks or the different question types. That will make you better, more effective at taking a test. However, doing test practice will not help you improve your English. Doesn't matter how many Cambridge books you do, doesn't matter how many IELTS prep books you do. Doing more and more test practice will not magically improve your score, because it will not make your English better. It might make you more familiar, so that yes, you do have a better understanding, so that you can, make sure that you're getting the right kind of question answered, but it doesn't improve your English. So one of the things that we want to emphasize really, and hope that you remember for you as a test taker, if you are preparing yourself, or if you're a teacher helping students and candidates prepare, is that really it needs to be about 80% of English learning and English language development, and about 20% of test taking practice. So the majority of the time, most of that time has to be built around this idea that we need to develop the English language ability, the English language skills, and then occasionally apply it through some IELTS style questions to see if you can really kind of understand. Right. We do have some time to answer some questions later. And again, if you've got any questions related to something that I have mentioned or Joanna's mentioned, please use the chat function at the side and we'll try to address those. But I'd like to hand over to Erica, who's now going to open up the floor to some of your more frequently asked questions.
Yes, so I hope everyone can hear me okay. My internet connection is a bit unstable, so if I drop out, one of my colleagues will step in. We've taken some of your questions from the pre-registration, and today we're going to address some of the more general questions. We've saved there are many questions coming in about IELTS writing and IELTS speaking, and so we'll be saving those for the next two upcoming sessions where we'll be going into those topics in much more detail. So don't worry, if you have any questions related to the productive skills, we will be getting to those in the next two sessions. But today we're going to focus on these few here, and then there's some questions coming into the chat that if we have enough time at the end, we'll also be answering some of those as well. So just to kick us off, I know that Dr. Joanna and Mark already mentioned this, they've already addressed this point already. But one of the first questions that we got quite a bit in the registration was, is it possible to prepare a student with basic knowledge of English for the IELTS test in a short amount of time? Mark, would you like to repeat yourself on that one?
Yeah, of course. And Joanna made a great point about this earlier. The answer is both no, but yes. You cannot go from a low level of ability, maybe an IELTS 5 to an IELTS 7 in maybe a month of practice. It's just not possible. You can't gain that amount of English in that short space of time. It takes a long time to develop. What you might be able to do is if somebody has already a very high level of English, but they have no understanding of IELTS, they don't know, well, how do I write this question and how do I answer this question about maps and stuff in writing? I'm not familiar with it. That's a lot easier because they already have the language ability. And all you're doing as a teacher or a trainer is just helping them apply their language skill and become a little bit more familiar with the test of how you address things that you need to do and things you don't need to do. So it's a bit of a yes/no question. But if you're trying to improve language, then no, you cannot do it in a short amount of time.
And that's exactly right.
Yeah.
If you want to improve your language ability and also improve your IELTS scores, it's best to allow ample preparation time so that you can focus on improving those underlying language skills and proficiency. That does take time. However, as Mark said, learning about the IELTS test itself could be done in a shorter amount of time, but you need to have that solid language foundation already there and then apply the knowledge about the test.
Okay, so the question is, are there any tricks or secrets to IELTS? Everybody wants to know the secrets. So either Erica or Joanna, are there any tricks? Are there any secrets?
I think this question comes up a lot all over the world. Wherever there are candidates preparing for IELTS, they always want to know the secret. And truly, the only secret is to improve your language foundation. IELTS is very transparent about the test. There are a number of practice resources available on the takeielts.org website, on the British Council website, Cambridge's website, and so on. And so they really try to make the information as widely available. They do not try to hide anything from students and teachers, and as well as there are public band descriptors of how the writing and how the speaking test are marked by examiners. So the short answer is no, there are no tricks or secrets to the IELTS test or scoring.
I'm going to jump on to the next question, if that's all right, Erica and Mark.
Mm-hmm.
I've mentioned it a couple of times that repetition is helpful to improve a student's IELTS scores. I can recall it's probably 20 years ago when I first started teaching IELTS, walking past a very senior teacher's classroom as she was talking to students about IELTS as well. And she was quite militantly saying to them, what are you reading? How often are you reading? What kind of books are you reading? If you want to get these candidates or these students were looking for band 6 and they wanted to go on to university, she was saying to them, if you want to go to university, you have to read every day and you have to read academic texts every day. So I think getting your students ready to do that, encouraging them to do that, helping them find interesting texts which they enjoy reading, supporting them in their reading and helping them see the link between their reading, their future success in IELTS, but probably more importantly, their future success using English. IELTS is, it's just a set of gates. There's a lot more exciting and motivating things beyond that set of gates in future study, in future workplaces, hopefully one day in future travel, and engaging with so much information and so many people all around the world. If you can help your students make that connection, I think you're going to help them improve their IELTS scores. So there we go, read, get them to read. Does anyone want to talk about the, this is an administrative question, isn't it? A huge difference between section scores.
Yes,
Okay,
so one of the,
sorry.
One of the questions that came in was if there is a huge difference between section or skill scores, is it possible to recheck the scores? So for example, if somebody's reading and listening skills are an IELTS band 7 and their speaking is a 6 and their writing is a 5, is it possible to recheck those scores?
So there's a couple of things to think about here. Now, say you have yourself or a candidate, as Erica said, they get maybe a 7 or 7.5 in listening and reading. If they're getting a 5.5 or a 5 in speaking or writing, the first thing that happens is there's already an inbuilt check system called second marking for IELTS. We don't know what the calculation is. We can't tell you what the calculation because we simply don't know. But naturally, every single IELTS test, there is already second marking. So for example, a student has been given a 5 for either for writing or for speaking, because those skills are often much lower, and that's given to a second examiner to mark again. So independently, Erica may have marked something live in a real test, and then maybe a week later, I independently have to reassess without knowing the original scores, what would I give this student? So there's already this double marking system to ensure that there's fairness. If you get a result at the end and you still get this, this score discrepancy, bear in mind that it may have already gone through this double check process, but there's still a process called an EOR, an inquiry on results, where you are able to ask for your reading score, sorry, your writing score, or your speaking score to be reassessed. And Amir Sayed will be able to provide information on how this is possible to do for IELTS Uzbekistan. So it's one of those things that can be done. Importantly, if you are a teacher, if you are a trainer, and students are kind of thinking, how long will it take me to prepare? A really good indication is just look at their reading score and their listening score. If their reading score and their listening score is about a 6, 99% of the time, their speaking and writing scores will be slightly lower or a bit lower than their productive skills. So you know, if the students are only about a 6 in their receptive skills, it's unlikely that they're going to be massively higher in the others. So you can do practice tests at home. You can do a quick test to see what that receptive skill level is. Now, of course, if you've got a student up at 7s or 7.5s, you know that they've got that language ability already. It's already ingrained, it's already inbuilt. So it might be easier to bring their speaking and writing scores up a little bit quicker. Okay. The next question, do IELTS questions change according to the local needs or to proficiency levels? Erica or Joanna, would one of you like to answer this one?
So it's important to note that the IELTS test is the International English Language Testing System, and therefore all of the test questions, the test papers, the texts in the IELTS test have been approved for international use, and they do not change according to different region or different scores anywhere in the world. So if you were to take the test in Beijing, China, it would be the same quality of test that you would take in any other country in the world.
Yeah. And also, some people think that, and we've heard this over the many, many years that we've been examining or training in IELTS, sometimes people think that, oh, there are too many people passing IELTS. IELTS is making the test harder this year so that fewer people can pass. That's completely not true. The tests are standardized. Now, there are a few questions on the side. A couple of people have asked about writing and how to improve on the writing. Don't worry, in the follow-up sessions, we'll talk specifically about the skills and the strategies needed to go from a 6, a 6.5 to a 7 in writing. There was a really good question that I saw is about the qualifications of IELTS instructors. Is there an accredited institution that teaches or certifies IELTS instructors? That's a great question. So there isn't a specific qualification to become an IELTS teacher. The British Council provides loads of training on teacher training resources and about proving understanding. There are free resources on preparing your students for IELTS on both takeielts.org and ielts.org. That's separate from becoming an IELTS examiner, which is a completely separate thing. But for you as trainers or for learners yourself, it really is about the things that we've talked about the skills, about understanding the language ability. Somebody else asked about how to find the right kind of material, or if they find, or students find reading a little bit too confusing or long or hard to focus. So going back to what Joanna said, when you think about those levels, the CEFR levels, the B1 and the B2, or possibly the C level, and looking at the skills and the language and the sub-skills that are involved in understanding that. If you search on the British Council website, and including the BBC and others, you can find CEFR related materials. if your student is a 5 or a 5.5, you need to be focusing entirely on the B1. No student is going to be able to magically understand something at the higher C1 or C2 levels. So they need to be doing something that's familiar, everything around the B1, because the reading is familiar to them and it just creeps up a little bit where there's something new to learn. The listening is familiar to them, but it just creeps up a little bit. There's something new to learn. If you are interested in teaching strategies or teaching theory, there's Vygotsky's Zone of Proximal Development, a ZPD. And that's the idea that most of what we learn is already familiar, but just outside that, there's new language, there's new things. And this is what we talk about, this being in the zone of just increasing that sphere a little bit.
All right, and with that, Joanna, if you could go to the next slide. I just want to make sure that I give the homework assignment before we run out of time. Everybody's favorite part. So next week we'll have our second session, and as we've mentioned, it will be focusing on IELTS writing in detail. We're going to look at understanding the tasks and skills that IELTS writing is targeting, especially taking a deeper dive into IELTS bands 5, 6, and 7, and what are the characteristics of academic writing. We'll also have a look at the band descriptors for both task 1 and task 2, and what exactly those descriptions mean and what the examiners are looking for when they rate essays. And then we'll also do a walkthrough for an application of those band descriptors. And with that, we have some homework, which I'm going to drop into the chat box in just a few minutes. And Amir said we'll also be distributing it via email. So, and if you have any troubles at all, you can contact the local Uzbekistan team and they'll be able to help you. But I'll just quickly give an overview of the homework assignment. You're going to receive 3 documents in total. You'll be receiving the IELTS band descriptors for task 1 and task 2, which are also available on many different websites, including takeielts.org. And you'll also be getting a webinar handout, which is pictured on the screen now, and it has 3 pages. So you'll be getting a sample task 1 and a sample task 2. And on the 3rd page, you'll have 3rd and 4th pages, sorry, it's 4 pages actually. You'll be scoring those sample essays. We want you to pretend that you are IELTS examiners and mark these like an IELTS examiner would. It's okay if you don't have much experience, or if you have a lot of experience, you can go ahead and write the band scores at the top, and then you can take notes. What do you think were the strengths and the weaknesses in each of the 4 marking criteria sections for each of those essays? And then that way, if you take the week or the weekend to do this assignment, when you come back for next week's session, you'll be very much prepared and be able to follow along quite well. So let me just go ahead and I'll drop those documents into the chat now.
Thank you very much, Erica and Mark, for setting us up for the writing next week. And I did notice in the chat just a moment ago that there was this precise question from one of our participants saying, I've got 6.5 in my writing, but I need 7. And how do I manage to get that score? Well, I promise that the session next week will be very closely targeted to the task features, the text features that you need to make sure you include to achieve that 7 in writing, and I think it will be a really super informative session. So I'd encourage everyone to come back then. Amir Saeed, did you want to take over now? I think we've delivered our part.
Yes,
of the
yes.
session.
Thank you so much, Joanna. Thank you, Erica, and of course, Mark, dear participants. So see you the next time. It is supposed to be in 11th of August, the same time, the same, no, not the same link. We will, but you have got another link. We will share attached documents to your emails today. Please keep in touch if you have any kind of questions related with, as Mark has mentioned about remarking system, feel free to contact me. You can approach me through our official page, or you can call to our call center to the office, and for sure they will connect you. Joanna? Okay. Bye.
That's great. Thank you
Okay.
very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for attending. See you next time.
Thank you for attending.
Thank you. We'll see you in the next session.
Next session. Bye.
Bye.